It's very interesting. I was looking at the bust of President Reagan, which I'm very grateful for. And I was out at the Reagan Library about 2 months ago with Nancy and did a small talk and a book signing. It's fascinating. If you get a chance later on, this particular bust is a perfect example of Reagan in that he's smiling. And Reagan was smiling almost all the time. If you look at pictures of Reagan, they're almost always optimistic, they're almost always confident, they're almost always happy. And I think that there's a profound underlying reason for that, which all too many conservatives can't quite relax and come to grips with. First, I think Reagan believed that he represented the long-term ocean of freedom. That just as Washington had helped launch it, just as Lincoln had helped define it, that he in fact personified and was part of a movement which in the long run represented literally both what God believes and has said to us, and the whole notion of our Declaration of Independence, that we are endowed by our Creator, that our rights come from God, and that we loan rights to the government. The government doesn't loan rights to us. And so I think Reagan felt that he was part of a bigger thing than himself, and he was able to relax into the larger thing, even through some fairly difficult times. Remember, in the late 70s, it was not at all obvious that freedom was going to win. We went through a very difficult period in which Jimmy Carter presided over probably the most destructive administration of modern times. And where there's a period there where we were at 13% inflation, 22% interest rates, sliding into the deepest recession since the Great Depression. The Soviet Union was on offense worldwide. There were Soviet forces in Afghanistan. In Mozambique and in Angola, they were financing the Cubans. They were paying for a peace movement. We now know this as a fact because we had the archives. They were paying a peace movement in Western Europe. They were on offense in Grenada and in Nicaragua and El Salvador. And Jimmy Carter went on national television and gave a speech in which he explained that the reason we all were feeling miserable is that we had malaise, and that we should grow up and recognize that we were going to fail, and that therefore if we just lower our expectations to the level of mediocrity he was prepared to give us, that we would all feel more happy. And that while we would be miserable, we could create misery stamps, and the federal government could ensure that misery was shared equitably across the entire country. Well, Reagan captured that moment in his campaign in 1980, and he had a technique, and he had been a Democrat. He'd been an FDR Democrat. He'd actually made commercials in 1948 for Truman and for Hubert Humphrey. And I don't know to what extent he got the rhythm of this, because this was not something normal Republicans could do, because normal Republicans are really stiff and they're ponderous by comparison. Reagan had this one great line where all through the 80 campaign where he'd say, a recession is when your cousin is unemployed. A depression is when you're unemployed. A recovery is when Jimmy Carter's unemployed. And that rhythm of humor, that sense that he represented, no matter what the immediate moment, he represented a long-term movement towards freedom that I think gave him a confidence under virtually every circumstance. I first had a chance to spend a little time with him one-on-one in the fall of 1974. I was a candidate for Congress for the first time. I was a Yankee-born Georgia Republican college professor with a strange name and a strange voice, clearly non-Southern accent, running in the middle of Watergate against the dean of the delegation. And it was a difficult year. And he was campaigning in October. He had one California state policeman with him and had an extra hour at the airport. And so we sat and he talked to me about how he did speeches. And that he had a set of cards that he carried, usually he carried them in his briefcase, and then before a speech, he would sort through about 30 to 50 cards, and he'd pick about 12 to 15 and put them in his pocket. And they were the speech. And there'd be, by definition, they were always in a slightly different order, and they were always a slightly different number of cards. And his reasoning was that while the core of his speech would be the same, the transitions would all be original, because he'd be going from card 11 to card 17, which he had not done before. And so he'd have to figure out, now how am I going to bridge from this story? And all of his cards were basically stories. He was a great storyteller. So how do I bridge from this story to this story? And it was the tension of watching him do that that gave you the sense of a totally new performance every time. And so the audience would get engaged, he would get engaged, the level of energy would be dramatically higher. And yet the cards were keeping him within a framework of what he wanted to get across, reminding him of the key things he wanted to get across. And he believed enormously in humor. I remember I was a very junior backbench member, so I was not an intimate of Ronald Reagan. I don't want to pretend that. But on a couple of occasions, I got to fly on Air Force One. And one of my most cherished pictures is he and I standing in our shirt sleeves laughing on Air Force One together. And he would always come back after the plane took off, and he would always tell stories. And he collected anti-Soviet stories. Now, it's hard, again, for those of you who are really young, it's hard to remember. There was once a Soviet empire. It was a powerful and evil thing. It was a genuine threat to take over the world. As late as 1980, a French intellectual was writing a book on the death of democracy. There was a genuine belief among our elites that the Soviet Union was inevitable, and that we, in fact, we had to have détente, which was a French word meaning understanding. And conservatives thought we should have angry détente and we'd yell at the Russians while we were losing. And liberals thought we could have happy détente and we could hug the Russians while we were losing. But the elites all believed that the Soviet Union was the wave of the future, and that we were losing. And Reagan had come along, and in this, exactly, I was just so struck by this bus, because it's the smile that reminded me. Reagan comes along, and a young reporter runs up to him and says, "What's your vision of the Cold War?" And we've had about the worst 7 years of the Cold War in the 44-year period of the Cold War, prior to Reagan getting this question. And Reagan says, calmly, pleasantly, 4 words that I think changed the history of the world. We win, they lose. Now, Strobe Talbot at Time magazine considered moving to New Zealand. The entire New York Times editorial board contemplated suicide. CBS News was convinced Reagan was a dangerous cowboy. The average American looked up and thought, our side, their side, of course. Our side wins, their side loses, got it. And it was part of this underlying mystique. So he collected anti-Soviet stories. The one I remember vividly, he told one time, this was in the Gorbachev phase. And Gorbachev was wrestling with glasnost and perestroika and was desperately trying to reform and modernize communism. He was not, in fact, a liberal. He was not, in fact, trying to get rid of communism. He was trying to modernize communism so it could survive. And Reagan said, man gets up in the morning, goes over, stands in line, waiting to get some beef. Waits 2 hours, gets to the front of the line, and the man says, "I'm so sorry, we just ran out." He sighs, he goes down the street, he gets in line to buy chicken. Gets to the very end of the line after an hour and a half, and the man says, "We're all out." He goes over to the third line for fish. He's standing in line, he says, "This is terrible. They talk about perestroika, they talk about glasnost. I can't get meat, I can't get chicken, I'll bet the fish will be gone." Man behind him taps him on the shoulder, says, "Comrade, you are very lucky Gorbachev is in charge. Under Brezhnev, I am KGB. I would have shot you for saying that." He gets home. His wife says, "So how is it?" He says, "It's worse than ever. They're out of bullets." Now notice the very subtle duality of that joke. Because that joke is saying 2 very different things simultaneously. It's saying, first of all, that centralized state bureaucratic monopolies fail. A line you could take, for example, to the Baltimore schools. And it says, second, that we have the moral superiority to tell a joke about your dictatorship. And it was devastating. And Reagan began every negotiating session with Gorbachev by telling him jokes. And it just drove him crazy. The first time they met, which was in itself extraordinary, and they met alone. George Shultz recounts with great pride that, Reagan, as people now begin to finally admit, Reagan was a very smart, very serious man who studied very hard when it mattered. And when he and Gorbachev met, he began the conversation with the following story. Man talks to the press. He says, I have fully as much freedom in the Soviet Union as I have in the United States. The reporter says to him, what do you mean? How can this be true? He says, I can go and I can stand up at Lafayette Park in front of the White House and I can say, Ronald Reagan is a terrible president, he should be thrown out. The reporter said, yes. And I can go, I can stand in Red Square in front of the Kremlin and I can say, Ronald Reagan is a terrible president, he should be thrown out. You see, I have the same freedom. And Gorbachev just stared at him. But he's friendly, cheerful, pleasant, but he's making a very powerful point. You know your system's a rotten dictatorship. I know your system's a rotten dictatorship, and I'm not afraid to tell you. You want to negotiate, we'll negotiate. But I don't have to be nice to negotiate. And I think that set a tone that people didn't understand and made a lot of what Reagan accomplished possible. Now, let me apply this to where you are, because I want to start and just say that I think that what Ellie Gold has done is very, very important. And I commend you for your civic leadership, for the number of hours you put in on this, for the number of emails you've sent, the phone calls you've made, the members of your entire extended family you have browbeaten into coming here, and all of the various folks who are here. And I also want to say to Tom Bernier and to Jeffrey Ferguson, this is how it begins. I mean, you may think this is a hardcore democratic state, although you just had a governor. And you may think this is really difficult, although you have several Republican members of the Congress. When I arrived as a high school junior in Columbus, Georgia in 1960, it was the third most democratic state in the country. The entire state convention was about half the size of this group. This last Monday, I attended the inauguration of Governor Perdue, who became the first Republican in history to be reelected in the history of Georgia. The inauguration began with the Georgia Republican Speaker of the House opening the special session, closed with the Republican Lieutenant Governor and the Senate Republican Majority Leader closing the session. Both senators from Georgia are Republican, and a majority of the House delegation is Republican. Now, that was a revolution that in 1960 was inconceivable. When I first won, I was the only Republican member of the delegation. The Democrats used to let me come to the delegation meetings because I was kind of a pet. I was a mascot. They thought it was interesting. It was like having a St. Bernard or something. Newt gets to come. Isn't this cute? We have a real Republican right here. And I want to share with you, just for a couple of minutes, some principles that I think are really important, and then I want to take questions. But let me, before I do that, I want to go back to something that Rabbi David Gottlieb said about where our rights come from and the core moral fabric of freedom in this country. It's very important when we say the Pledge of Allegiance that we say one nation under God. And it's very important to understand that we are the only society in the world that says unequivocally, you are endowed by your Creator. I recently wrote a book called Rediscovering God in America because I got so angry at the Ninth Circuit Court suggesting that it was unconstitutional to say one nation under God that I concluded that we had to have a straight, head-on, knock-down, drag-out discussion about the nature of America. And Rediscovering God in America takes you from the National Archive to the Washington Monument to the Jefferson Memorial to the Lincoln Memorial, to the Roosevelt Memorial, to the Second World War Memorial, to the US Capitol, to the Supreme Court, which, by the way, has Moses and the Ten Commandments on the wall, and opens every session asking God's support. I mean, you just look at this stuff, and what you see is how stunningly outside the American tradition the modern secular leftist critique is. It's just historically false. And so I really think it's important to start with this notion that we have a very precious thing called American civilization. This is a unique country. People come from all over the planet, and they learn to work with each other within the rule of law with remarkable speed. People who back home would kill each other become business partners in America. Their children play on the same team. They live in the same neighborhood without fear. It is an astonishing achievement. And one of the greatest dangers we have is the systematic effort of the academic left to create literally amnesia about the nature of America by failing to teach American history and refusing to explain where we come from. And it's a very important problem because at the center of who we are is a learned cultural DNA. We're not genetically Americans. We're not even geographically Americans. We're Americans because we've inherited, as of next spring, a 400-year tradition of people who believe their rights come from God, that they're endowed with freedom, that the work ethic, the rule of law, and the right to private property give them a chance to improve their lives and their families' lives, and that limited government created for the purpose of establishing law should in fact have a very restricted role in their lives so that they grow as citizens into having primary responsibility. It's a very sophisticated, very powerful model, and it has been under assault now for over 50 years by essentially a European introduction, a post-French revolutionary secularism, a socialist belief in big government, and a belief in the bureaucratic and academic classes that they can spend your money better than you can, and therefore they should tax it before you waste it, because they will then wisely spend it on your behalf. This is a very fundamental distinction about the nature of the country. I also want to point out that the Star Spangled Banner, which was very beautifully done, sung by the audience, played on the trumpet, and I must say, it struck me being in Baltimore with the national anthem was particularly touching because it's real. The national anthem didn't emerge out of some fantasy. It emerged out of a historic memory of a genuine experience and a long night. Remember, the first verse ends, "Land of the free and home of the brave." And I want to spend just a brief moment on national security and foreign policy before I talk about how you win the argument here in Maryland. But I think we need a lot more conversation as Americans about the inextricable connection between the land of the free and the home of the brave. The level of routine cowardice in our elite media and the level of routine cowardice on our left is breathtaking. We are in a mortal war with enemies who wish to destroy us. The irreconcilable wing of Islam makes clear on television, on websites, in brochures, in every way they can, that if they can get nuclear or biological weapons, they are going to kill us. The British this summer arrested a couple who were, this was part of the plot to destroy 10 airplanes in one day. They arrested a couple who were going to use their 8-month-old baby in order to disguise the bomb material as baby food. And I try to tell every audience I talk to, you have to think about this and let it enter into your head and into your heart and contemplate what this means. If I come to you and I say, we have enemies who have 15 to 25-year-old males who are willing to die as long as they can kill you, I'm just describing a warrior culture, which is historically normal. But if I come to you and I say, there are people on the planet who hate you so much that they will kill their own child as long as they get to kill you too. I am describing a level of ferocity and a level of intensity that we are completely unused to dealing with. And we have not yet come to grips with this. This is a problem which, when combined with the effort of the North Koreans to get nuclear weapons and missiles, when combined with the hatred that the dictator of Venezuela has for us, when combined with the general problems we have with Iran and with Syria, is a very, very real challenge to our survival. And I think, and you cannot understand the fight we're in unless you take to heart how serious this is. We could lose 2 or 3 American cities to nuclear weapons in our lifetime. We could have a biological attack that kills 1 million or more people. None of this is fear talk. Read what Ahmadinejad, the head of Iran, says publicly. I mean, he doesn't disguise it. He says publicly on television, we need to defeat the Anglo-Saxons and eliminate Israel from the face of the earth. And I ask all of my liberal friends, what do you think he means? Now, I think, frankly, if I were a tenured faculty member at Harvard or Berkeley, I could probably explain to you that the term defeat the Anglo-Saxons and eliminate Israel from the face of the earth is, in fact, highly symbolic language suggesting he was abused as a child and indicating his desperate need for therapy. But I'm just a historian. And I'll tell you, in history, when somebody says to you, I want to wipe you out, it is useful to think they're telling the truth. I recently had a chat with Tom Friedman, who's clearly not where I am ideologically. But Friedman spent a number of years as the New York Times reporter in Beirut during a very violent period. And he said to me, he said, you know, I'd forgotten some of the basic rules of the Middle East. He said, the first of which is, it doesn't matter what they tell you in private. He said, it's the opposite of the West. What matters is what they say in public, because in the end, that's what they do. So I just want to say to you, as you watch the president later on tonight, and I'm going to do Hannity and Combs at 10:30 and comment on it. As you watch the president, we have a huge problem. The president is not as articulate as I wish he was. They have not made as many changes as I think they need to. But he is, in every way he knows, a sincere man, moving forward, gradually getting tougher, gradually learning more, and this is hard. And I would say 2 things to my friends on the left. The first is, if we accept defeat, as they urge, then what do they think the consequence will be? A defeated America, a collapsed Iraq, an emboldened Iran, an emboldened Syria, an emboldened Al-Qaeda, an emboldened Hezbollah, an emboldened Hamas, an emboldened North Korea, an emboldened China wondering if our word means anything in Taiwan, since it clearly meant nothing in Iraq. I think that's a dramatically more dangerous world. The last time we were that weak was under Jimmy Carter. We had 444 days of a hostage crisis in Iran, an American embassy burned in Pakistan, and an American ambassador killed in Afghanistan. I had a Marine general tell me recently, if they believe we are weak, we do not have enough Marine units to evacuate the number of embassies that will be under siege. And so I would say to my friends on the left, are you truly prepared to explain to the country the consequences of your decision? To lose control of the Persian Gulf, to have the Iranians dominant, to potentially lose Israel? Or are you going to reassure me that there's some rational, reasonable way to be defeated? I think it's a very big gamble. But then I would say to all of us who think we have to win, we are going to have to do far more than the president will announce tonight. The problem we have is very simple. It's the problem that the airlines industry has had for 20 years. It's the problem that the American automobile manufacturers have had. When you are leading a large corporate structure, it is very hard to change fast enough to catch up with reality. I think GM's probably had 15 major reorganizations. None of them deep enough, serious enough, and aggressive enough. The major airlines, people like Delta, which I used to represent in Congress, United, American, airlines that have gone under like TWA, Eastern, they just couldn't change fast enough. This is a major crisis for us in Washington. The State Department doesn't work. Over half the Pentagon doesn't work. The intelligence system doesn't work. The White House interagency doesn't work. The Treasury, Justice, Agriculture, you name it, are not responsive. It's not just policy. I said on Tim Russert the other morning, it's as though he wanted to go to Boston, I wanted to go to Los Angeles. We were having a huge policy debate, and the car outside had no engine. And so whoever wins the policy debate runs out, jumps in the car to go to where we've now agreed we're going, and it doesn't move. And nobody in Washington is willing to slow down enough to realize how fundamental this problem is. And we're going to have to, over the next 3 to 5 years, fundamentally overhaul and profoundly change the national security and homeland security apparatuses of the United States, or we're going to risk very significant defeats. Now, that's not why you're here, but I think it's so important to our future and our survival. I want to take a minute to talk about it. Let me very briefly tell you what I think you should do. This is my personal belief. I've been active in the conservative movement, I guess, since as a high school student. I began reading about Barry Goldwater and read Conscience of a Conservative and was active in '64, and I've done a lot of things since then. I think that there are several big changes we need that need to move conservatism to a new plateau. We need to move from principles to policies. That is, you say you're for markets, fine. Tell me how that applies to healthcare. Tell me how that applies to the environment. Tell me how that applies to education. Tell me how that applies to retirement planning. Tell me how that applies to competing with China and India. So what are the policies that grow out of our principles? Second, we have to move from ideas to solutions. Solutions is a much higher standard than ideas. It's relatively easy to have an idea. It takes a tremendous amount of work to take that idea and turn it into a solution. Third, we have to understand that people actually listen at 3 levels. They listen personally, they listen historically, and they listen politically. And think of it as a really big personal box, a medium-sized historic box, and a really tiny political box. Almost all of our consultants and most of our staffs live in the world of politics. So they babble at each other endlessly. They read Hotline every day. They read the Drudge Report. They watch Fox News. They listen to Hannity on radio. They are totally immersed in politics, and they love it. The average, normal, well-adjusted human being almost never engages in that world. And our challenge is to take our policies as we translate them into principles, and to take our issues as we translate them into solutions, and describe them first at a personal level. I mean, there is no greater failure of the conservative movement than the fact that young African American males are killed regularly with no change in their neighborhoods. They're imprisoned routinely with no change in the quality of their life except it gets worse. If an African American male who drops out of high school has a 73% likelihood of being unemployed in their 20s and a 60% likelihood of being in jail by their 30s. Now, for us to not see that as an opportunity at the most human of levels, to walk into neighborhoods and churches and look people in the eye who are living lives of pain and say to them, we can do better. Here are our solutions, and here are our policies, and here's how they'll affect your life personally. Now that would change America in fundamental ways. And I could go through a dozen examples. It's important to remember that Margaret Thatcher's great argument, or great statement, first you win the argument, then you win the vote. But what conservatives don't understand, and I'm saying this to you because I think this is a very serious group, and you have a real opportunity to fundamentally begin to change things in Maryland, and by changing things in Maryland to create an intellectual process which will change things in many other states. To win the argument, you have to win it in the other person's mind. When most people hear Margaret Thatcher's phrase, first you win the argument, then you win the vote, they think, okay, I'm going to get ready, so I'm going to be fully armed. I'll be ready to argue. And they'll have all these facts and figures, etc., but they won't have a clue about the nature of the person they're talking with. So you first have to, all effective communication occurs in the mind of the listener, not the speaker. So to win the argument, you both have to have the policies and the solutions, and you have to understand how to articulate them in a form that the person you're trying to convince will hear you, which requires that you listen. Because if you haven't listened, how do you know what they think before you start talking? And one of the things that I would strongly urge you to do is tackle Baltimore